Hi everybody! This video introduces you to figures of speech. Broadly speaking, a figure of speech is a way of saying one thing in terms of another. There are many different kinds of figures of speech. Some of these are puns, personification, similes, and metaphors. In this class, we're going to focus on the two most popular figures of speech, which are similes and metaphors. You're probably already somewhat familiar with these terms, but just to remind you, a simile is an explicit comparison between two things, usually using the words like, as, than, appears, or seems. In other words, it's a comparison and there's a word that signals explicitly that two things are being compared. An example of this would be the statement, life is like a long journey. Here we have like being directly compared to a long journey, and we have the word like to signal that these things are being compared. A metaphor is similar to a simile in that it compares two dissimilar things. However, in a metaphor, the comparison is implicit instead of explicit. You don't have a word like, as, than, appears, or seems in order to signal that two things are being compared to one another. An example of this would be the statement, life is a journey. In this statement, we don't have a word that tells us this is a comparison. We have to sort of deduct that ourselves as readers. I'm going to walk you through a couple examples of these figures of speech in poems. The first poem I'm going to talk about is You Fit Into Me by Margaret Atwood, and this poem uses a simile. So I'll go ahead and read the poem and then talk a little bit about how the simile is functioning in this poem. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. So in the first stanza, the first two lines, we have an explicit comparison of what we assume to be a relationship, so a you and a me, and the way that those two people sort of relate to one another. And it's being compared to the relationship between a hook and an eye, so the way a hook fits into an eye. And in this first couple lines, it's not necessarily explicitly, especially violent or negative. If you're a woman, you may be pretty familiar with the hook and eye clothing fastener that's used for dresses and for bras and a lot of different kinds of clothes. And then also you might be familiar with the sort of hook and eye locking mechanism. So a hook and eye is not necessarily a bad or negative thing. In fact, to many readers, it may initially signal this idea that these two things kind of belong together, that there's almost this sort of complementarian relationship happening. You know, that these two people, you and me, sort of fit together and make sense together, almost like sort of puzzle pieces. However, in the second stanza, this initial simile, the relationship being compared to a hook and eye, is sort of shifted and made explicitly sort of violent and negative. The hook gets modified as a fish hook, and the eye gets modified as an open eye, with the implication that it's like sort of a human eye or an animal eye. And so suddenly this image that was once, possibly somewhat positive becomes sort of explicitly negative. And in this, we sort of see this sort of evolving view of this relationship. So it's initially compared to something that is possibly sort of positive. These two people actually sort of fit together. And then the second one, it becomes actually this is sort of a negative and violent relationship. And the you in the poem is actually doing sort of damage to the speaker. And then the second poem I'm going to talk about uses a metaphor. So this is a poem by Emily Dickinson. Presentiment is that long shadow on the lawn. So once again, I'll go ahead and read the poem and then talk a little bit about how the metaphor is working in this poem. So the poem reads, presentiment is the long shadow on the lawn, indicative that suns go down, the notice to the startled grass that darkness is about to pass. So in this poem, we have the implicit comparison of presentiment, which is this sense that something is going to happen, knowing that something is going to happen even sort of before it happens, to a lengthening shadow that sort of signals the end of the day. So this feeling, this sort of foreknowledge that something is going to happen is being compared to signs, in this case a shadow, that's signaling that you know that something is going to happen, that the sun is going to go down. That shadow that tells us that the sun is going to go down. And then it's sort of further developed in the second stanza as the notice to the startled grass that darkness is about to pass. And here, if before it was sort of maybe somewhat sort of negative or sort of eerie, here it becomes even sort of in some ways more sort of negative because it becomes comparative to sort of knowledge that darkness is about to come. And we usually think of, day as being positive and darkness as being sort of somewhat negative. So we have presentiment, or this foreknowledge, being compared to these sort of signs that the day is going to end and the night is going to come. So that's it for these sort of short explanations of how similes and metaphors work. We're going to be talking about them in a little bit more detail in the discussions for this week. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about them.